The 170 nations now agree this is the time to act. Leaders signed the agreement at the United Nations headquarters. It has lofty goals like capping the rise of global temperatures and providing funding to poorer countries. CCTV's Nathan King begins our coverage from the United Nations.
Yeah, Mike, quite incredible considering where we were. Remember back in 2009, the Copenhagen summit, which broke down in acrimony and animosity with the developing and the developed world pointing fingers at each other. Well, today was very, very different.
Excellencies, we shall now proceed to the signing of the Paris Agreement.
A day many thought would never come, an ambitious climate deal. If implemented, it could literally save the planet. Signing the deal is just the start. Many countries, including China, say they're already implementing ambitious plans to cap carbon emissions by 2030 or before.
We will take effective actions at home to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. China has set the target of achieving the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions around 2030 and making best efforts to peak early, and relevant actions have been incorporated into our national development plans.
The US knows keeping any increase in global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius will be a challenge, but one that Beijing and Washington are ready to meet.
The new energy future, the efficiencies, the alternative resources, the clean options, none of what we have to achieve is beyond our capacity technologically. The only question is whether it is beyond our collective resolve.
Both countries agree that switching to renewable energy is an investment, not a cost, and will do all they can to lead the way.
First, we'll work hard to cut greenhouse gas emissions. We'll deploy stronger measures to achieve the targets set out in the 13th five-year plan. Second, we will continue to push for international cooperation on climate change, helping to build an open, effective, and win-win global climate governance system.
Still to be worked out how to help developing nations pay for a switch to renewable energy and mitigate climate changes that are already happening. The international community has pledged to raise a whopping $100 billion a year by 2020.
It's a considerable amount of money. Nathan, this is by means, though, not a done deal. Each individual country has to ratify the agreement, and it's expected to be difficult in some places, isn't it?
Yeah, right. We have the agreement in Paris, we have the signing today, and then we've got the joining. And that's going to be the big problem. Both the US and China said they're going to do it as quickly as possible. In fact, China says they're going to do it by September. Of course, the G20 meeting, of course, in China as well. That's a big landmark. But there are big questions about other countries, especially the European Union. A lot of them have to get through their national parliaments. There are some resistance. And here in the United States, remember, we're in the middle of an election campaign. The Republican Party doesn't agree with climate change, even exists, a lot of them, so they may actually pull out of the agreement if they're elected. There are legal challenges as well. India, too, one of the biggest emitters, has a big problem getting it through their parliament. So we are not there yet. But as everyone here says, we have to unite now. It's a race against time, as the UN Secretary General said, and one emitter pulling back means the rest of the world is affected.
Very dramatic day, nonetheless. Nathan King, live for us at the United Nations. Perhaps nowhere are the effects of climate change more drastically felt than among small island states. Rising sea levels are redefining coastlines, and extreme weather is already forcing migration. Could this agreement help avert a worst-case scenario? CCTV's Li-Ling Tan is live at the United Nations with that part of the story.
Hey, Mike, yes, could this agreement avert a worst-case scenario? That's what these small island nations are hoping for, that this could avoid further disasters stemming from climate change. Remember that these small island nations, for them, their existence is already being threatened by rising sea levels. So a lot is at stake. And the fact that so many of these countries sign on to the agreement this session, and 13 of these island nations joined the agreement as well this session, it indicates two important things. One, their confidence in this agreement, and two, the urgent need for a solution. For island nations, from the Caribbean to the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, the tides are already turning as global warming wreaks havoc, eroding coastlines, causing record tides and extreme weather events. Many of them will be dealt a double blow. A new study by the journal Nature Climate Change estimates up to 73% of island states, home to 16 million people, will face increasingly dry conditions by the middle of the century, even as rising sea levels are swallowing up their coastlines.
Cyclone Winston, Cyclone Palm, and Hurricane Erika, to name only a few, shows that many islands' climate change is truly a matter of life and death.
His Excellency, the Minister of Environment and Energy of Maldives.
To avert disaster, island nations including the Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Vanuatu and the Marshall Islands have signed on to the historic climate agreement.
There's definitely no plan B for these countries. And if your frontline states are rallying behind this Paris Agreement and what was delivered in Paris, I think that we have something here that we need to work with, something that we need to build on to ensure that these countries and their people have a viable future.
While these countries are among the most threatened, they're also the nations that emit the least amount of greenhouse gases, which is why this Paris Agreement also encourages richer developed countries, the world's major emitters of greenhouse gases, to help the less developed and most vulnerable ones. As part of the deal, richer developed nations will send $100 billion a year to help developing states build climate resilience and put their countries and economies on a low-carbon path.
I think the Paris Agreement has given them hope. It has given them hope that global efforts to address climate change will be accelerated.
In a sign of eagerness to see its measures take effect, 13 small island nations are fully ratifying the Paris Accord at the UN, going beyond the signing ceremony to submit their action plans on how each of them will do their part.
Leland, let's talk about this number. You just brought it up, $100 billion per year to help developing states. But how long does that agreement last?
Well, there's some confusion about this figure. This $100 billion financing mechanism, it actually builds on the Copenhagen Accord in that it covers the period after 2020. So we're talking about the time, the years between 2020 and 2025. And because this financing mechanism was such a crucial part in the negotiations to get developing nations on board, it also looks down into the future, into future financing timelines through a review system of sorts. So every 2 years or so, developed countries and developing countries can provide an assessment, assess the mobilization of funds, how funds are being used and deployed, and also identify or determine projected levels of future financing for subsequent cycles. And of course, this financing, or rather these reviews, go beyond just looking at how much money is needed for future financing, but also where this money should be going and what kind of investments should be made.
There's a lot to cover there. Thanks so much, Leland Tim. At the United Nations, just the UN summary of the Paris Climate Agreement is 31 pages long, meaning there is a lot of information to digest. I asked Barbara Finnemore for her take. She's Asia Director of the China Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Last December, over 190 countries representing 95% of global CO2 emissions agreed to this historic step. And today, 175 of those countries signed the agreement on the first day it was opened for signature. This is a record number of countries. So it shows political momentum, political will. The Paris Agreement sets forth some binding commitments, some binding obligations on every country that joins it. They have to pledge, make their climate commitments, and continue to review them and make them make them stronger over time. It requires them to take domestic action to meet those commitments and to report their progress and their emissions. Now, if you look at what the countries have pledged so far, it's not enough to save the climate, but the Paris Agreement is a promising platform for accelerating that climate action over time.
How do you accelerate it, though? Because there are some who say, it's a game of catch-up at this stage.
the pledges themselves are not enough to meet the target of keeping the global warming increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. However, as I said before, the countries have to review their pledges every 5 years and to accelerate them to reflect their highest level of emissions. So as they get used to taking this climate action, see the benefits for their economy, for public health, for jobs, they will undoubtedly be stronger. But interestingly enough, China is responsible for a quarter of the world's global CO2 emissions. And as a result of the drop in China's coal consumption, China's own CO2 emissions are stabilizing, as well as that of the global CO2 emissions. So that gives us hope that we can reach that 2 degrees Celsius target over time.
Barbara, if you will, discuss China's plans to meet these commitments. What are the steps that China is willing to take?
So China's signing of the Paris Agreement today represents its acknowledgement of the need for it to do its part in reducing global climate change. But it also is squarely within China's own interest, because all the steps that it is taking, and it has a very integrated approach towards climate change. So what is China doing to meet its climate pledge? It's already been taking action to cut down its reliance on coal substantially and phase out heavy industry in favor of a cleaner, more service-oriented economy that is the key to its long-term sustainability. China is also the world leader in investment in clean energy. Last year alone, it invested $111 billion in renewable energy, which is 1/3 of the world total. This is a model, or this can be a model for other countries on how to address their CO2 emissions while improving their economy.
Let me ask you one final question. The LA Times had this article, a piece about a new study in the journal Nature, which really found that virtually all of Americans are now experiencing mild winters, and this is what they prefer. So it's hard to complain about the weather outside when the winters are a lot nicer. So researchers are now expressing some concern that perhaps Americans will become complacent, or because they're benefiting in this way, that they're not going to demand action. Is that a concern of yours?
Well, yes, the winters were milder. In fact, the first 3 months of this year were the hottest ever recorded, and by a large margin. But let's not forget, it's not just global warming here. We're talking about devastating climate change, the severe weather experiences that so many cities and people in the United States have been experiences are in many cases linked to climate change, increased flooding, increased droughts, increased tornadoes, hurricanes, and storms. And so this, I think, is going to help to bring home to people that the Earth is crying out for action here. And if we want to protect our country and the world for our grandchildren, something has to be done, and the sooner the better.
Barbara Finnemore joining us from New York. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this Paris Agreement was reached in December of 2015. Just a few months before that, though, there was a separate deal between the world's two biggest polluters, China and the United States. So how did that accord influence actions in Paris? We're joined live from Beijing by CCTV's Han Pong. Take us back to September of 2015. How important was that agreement?
Mike, many analysts say that the Paris deal wasn't possible without a compromise between China and the United States last September. It was in this agreement that China made some big pledges, including a $3 billion fund to help developing countries upgrade their carbon-emitting factories. China also pledged specific targets for capping its own carbon emissions. The new commitments from the world's biggest developing country created huge momentum for other developing countries to sign on to the climate change accord in Paris. India was one of them.
When the world's two largest economies, energy consumers and carbon emitters come together like this, then there's no reason for other countries, whether developed or developing, to not do so as well.
So let's fast forward to present-day China. How is the country cutting emissions, and will that goal of peaking emissions by 2013 actually be met?
Well, China is now making a lot of efforts to curb its carbon emission, not just because of its global commitment, but also because the weather that is happening now in China. Today we have seen some blue sky here, but it's been very frequent in China that the smog has been shrouding big cities like Beijing and Shanghai. And also, according to the latest announcement from China's special representative to the climate talks, China will invest a total of 3 billion RMB, or almost $5 million before 2030 to reduce its carbon emissions and clean up its air. China also made a pledge in 2014 that its emissions will peak by 2030, and now it appears that China may be able to reach that goal 5 years earlier than promised, which means that China's carbon emission would start decreasing in 2025. Some experts say that if China achieves this goal, it would be unprecedented in human history because no country has ever maintained a high growth rate like China's, while at the same time reducing its carbon emissions. Back to you, Mike.
Peng, live force in Beijing. Thanks so much. In the lead up to the Paris Climate Agreement, several developing nations were opposed to a deal, but then something changed. They joined the agreement along with others. Now the question, how can those developing countries actually meet the terms of this deal? I'm joined live from New York by Ramping Song. He heads a program for developing countries at the World Resources Institute. How hard will it be for these developing countries to actually implement this deal, do you think?
Well, it's going to be challenged, but I think that we're seeing a lot of momentum from countries, that we're seeing that a lot of new investments coming up to the to actual projects. We are seeing that countries are actually start to draw up their roadmaps, drawing up the policies, and I think there's a lot of going on, and there's need to be a lot of actual investment from the business and from cities as well.
I'm sure you just heard Han Peng talking about China. It's planning to invest in pretty expensive energy projects, but at the same time, the economic growth is slowing. So at some point, will China's slower growth actually impact its ability to deliver on these projects, do you think?
I think that it's on contrary, that just because China can no longer depends on the old development pathways, that's actually no longer possible to rely on the high emission, high polluting industries to propel the economy. And on the other way, that actually investing in renewable energies, green economy is the way to stimulate the growth, actually to provide higher quality life standard for the Chinese people. So rather than the economic growth as a barrier, on that way around, investment in climate change to mitigate climate change, investment in clean technology is the way to stimulate economic growth.
And we're looking at some video here, which we've seen a lot of in the last year or so, people with masks walking around in China on these really smoggy days. But there's another country out there that also is dealing with an enormous amount of pollution, and that's, of course, India. How do you see them factoring into all of this?
Well, I actually think that India is also making a lot of progress. Last year, India is also making the top 10 countries that invest in renewable energy. We see 22% of annual increase in renewable energy. So, of course, India is in a very different stage than China. They have their own priorities they need to deal with, but I think they're on board to actually find climate change, and they also see the benefits, to deal with the clean air, to provide the clean air, and actually to provide the clean energy to increase the energy access to the poor people.
Great symbolism at the United Nations today. Great photo op, as they say. But we've been talking about the difference between signing an agreement and actually implementing it. You deal a lot with this sort of thing in the past. Did countries do a good job of actually living up to their climate change pledges?
Actually, we can just, I can lay out a few facts and let the audience decide whether they're doing a good job or not. Just since Paris, we have a few new information, right? So 17 states in the U.S. from both Republican and Democrat parties pledge to take up their climate change actions and actually increase energy efficiencies and scale up renewable energy investments. Mexico, thanks to its first clean energy auction, actually increased its renewable energy, solar energy power by more than 500% this year. Morocco actually started its first, the biggest solar power plants in the world. And, other actually companies like, the Tata Motors in India and then Hewlett Packard in the United States, they actually recently committed to achieve 100% renewable energies. And, there's a huge financial institution coalition led by the Bank of America recently pledged $8 billion to deal with climate change. So we can see this real change there in just short 4 months. then envision that, what will happen over time.
So you see the glass half full. Your best guess, when will this deal be implemented, and what role will these developing countries play in all of this?
Developing countries will play a big role, but actually developed countries will actually continue to play a leadership role because they need to show the pathway forward. But actually, developing countries, including China, are increasingly understanding that this is good for the economy, and they're showing, setting examples, and it's actually setting a benchmark to show what's possible and to other developing countries. But every country is a little bit different. They have to figure out their own way to achieve there. They have to figure out their own roadmap, their own policies. They need to figure out their own investment channels. So there's lots of challenges there. But I think we will get there.
Ratifying Song joining us from New York. Thanks so much. For the past several years, CCTV America has invested considerable time and effort in covering this really important climate change story, and Sean Calebs has been and continues to be our point person on all of this, and he's here on the set talking to us about global warming up close and personal, because you've been there, I mean, on the front lines, Greenland, the Antarctic, Brazil as well. Arctic, yes. We'll get you to the Antarctic soon enough, right? Talk to me about Greenland especially. There's been a lot of writing about that in the last couple of days.
This is really interesting because I remember vividly reading on the wires about the dramatic changes that the Greenland ice sheet was undergoing in August of 2012. Something like 93% of the ice sheet itself was melting. That doesn't mean the entire sheet was melting. It's like if you take an ice cube out of the freezer and set it down, you'll get melting over that surface. That's what was going on there. And literally, about 3 days later, our trip was approved and we were on our way. And really what, I got a first-hand glimpse. I didn't realize, Greenland is a very huge nation, but very small population. That population is going to go through some tremendous changes. About 88% of them native Greenlanders. So many people want to move in to that area and tap into the natural resources. But right there, you're seeing what's going on. The glaciers are calving, they're melting at an alarming rate. And already this year, the fastest rate of melting in Greenland, breaking the 2012 record, and all this fresh water from this massive ice sheet is pouring in to the North Atlantic. It is affecting the salinity in that area. Fish stocks are changing. The changes that are going on are amazing. And to anybody who says, this is not man-made, they just don't listen to scientists. I know that there are going to be people out there who are going to say I'm completely wrong, but in listening to these scientists, going over their research, talking to them, and then seeing what's going on firsthand, it's really hard to believe that it isn't.
Well, so you've been to Greenland, Brazil, and the Arctic. What's been the major takeaway? Because each place is unique, it's different, but the overall theme is still the same, isn't it?
I think the biggest thing is how you're looking at one area, but really, we're such a global world. What goes on in China affects people here. What goes on in Russia affects other areas. And that's what we're seeing. And what we're seeing, and we heard Ratifying talk about it earlier, all these nations really coming together for the good of the environment. There are only a limited number of nations that have land in the Arctic. The United States is one, Russia, Norway, they're a member of the Arctic Council. But there are a number of nations like India and China that have a great deal at stake, and now they are invested, they're doing work, they're doing research, and it's really, I think, this kind of coming together that led to the agreement that we saw in Paris. To me, that's the biggest takeaway, just how everything is affected on a global scale.
You looked into something that I found rather surprising, shocking in fact. It's not a light switch. We can't turn it on and off. But if we could turn it off, what would we see in terms of rising temperatures?
You're talking about if we took the carbon out of it, if we stopped the emissions tomorrow. Yeah. Of course, global temperatures would stop, but it doesn't work that way. It's kind of like a sponge that's wet, and it takes a long time for that sponge to dry out. If we stopped all the greenhouse emissions tomorrow, give me one guess. How long do you think it'd take?
I'm not going there.
40 years.
Oh
it would before the global temperature stabilized, meaning before it got cooler. So all this effort to reduce global warming by 2 degrees Celsius in the coming year, going back to the start of the industrial age, it's a big task. It is a heavy task, and it takes strong leaders to stand forward, and it takes new regulations, and it takes doing things differently that people have always done, leaving the lights on, running water, not recycling, all those things. If we don't do those in the United States, it's ridiculous for us to complain about developing countries. The United States has had 120 years of industrialization. It's kind of hard to tell nations in Africa and parts of Asia that are ramping up, hey, don't make the same mistakes we made and find a different way to generate all this power.
All right, Sean, thanks so much. Well, just ahead, the day's other headlines, including sharp views on whether the United Kingdom should leave the European Union, and more on this historic climate change agreement on Earth Day 2016. Welcome back. Leaders of over 170 nations marked Earth Day by signing the Paris Agreement on climate change. The goal of the action plan is to get the world on track to limit global warming, and yet this is just one step among many needed to avoid the worst. CCTV's Nathan King is in New York at United Nations headquarters with an update on this historic day.
Mike, you're absolutely right. A historic day, especially when you compare it back to 2009. Remember the Copenhagen summit that broke down in acrimony with the developing worlds pointing fingers at each other, not least the US and China. Look where we are now. Remember that historic agreement between the US and China before the Paris Agreement that really set the way, where developing world would cap their emissions while the developed world would actually reduce emissions at the same time. That helped with the Paris Agreement, and then of course the signing here. But as you know, signing is not joining, and even though we had 175 countries here, it won't really come into effect until 55 countries with 55% of the emissions basically implement this agreement, and it's going to be a hard slog. There are problems here in the United States about implementing it. There are judicial challenges. We're in the middle of an election campaign where the Republican Party largely are climate change deniers, and they could withdraw from the agreement at any time. We have a lot of problems with European countries who have to ratify this through their parliaments. So there is going to be a long, hard slog. But the fact that this day happened at all is testament to the global community and pushing for action, not least between the US and China as well. We'll wait and see. But remember, two very ambitious targets: keeping global warming below the 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and also providing $100 billion a year for the developing world to mitigate climate change and pay for the transition to renewable energy. It's ambitious. As the UN Secretary General said, it's a race against time. We'll see if the world could do it.
Nathan King, live for us there in New York. Thanks so much. The El Nino weather phenomenon brought months of drought to Colombia. The consequence was an energy crisis that pushed the country to the verge of scheduled blackouts. The government says it's rallied to prevent the shortages, and it seems to have worked, at least temporarily. CCTV correspondent Michelle Begay has this report from Bogota.
The Gomez family has always been conscious of the environment. As a family of 8, water conservation in their household is a priority.
If you brush your teeth correctly, all that's needed is a glass of water. I invite everyone to save water, save energy, and take care of our environment.
With this level of natural commitment to the environment, the family was ready when the government called on all households to do their part to conserve energy. Last month, the government launched Turning Off Pays Off, an energy savings campaign that will temporarily change the way electric bills are calculated by reducing monthly costs if citizens conserve energy. Households and businesses who use more than the average amount will be charged double. The new measure also requires government buildings to turn off power after 6 p.m. and reduce energy consumption by 10% per month. The Gomez family has already answered the call to use less energy.
Entonces, para ahorrar, eso es muy fácil.
It is very easy. We use curtains that let the light through. We only use 1 or 2 light bulbs if necessary. And if we are watching TV, we turn the lights off.
Televisor en el momento de y uno ahorra mucha luz.
To avoid power rationing, the government also boosted their imports of energy from Ecuador, called on large electric consumers to generate their own power, and increased the use of thermoelectric plants. The government said the measures paid off. President Juan Manuel Santos said that in 6 weeks, Colombians had saved 3 times more than the government set goal.
Our goal of 400 gigawatts was surpassed 3 times. Today we have saved 1,200 gigawatts of energy.
But even with the threat of blackouts lifted, some experts believe the energy crisis could have been avoided. Colombia's former Minister of Energy says the problem is that almost 70% of Colombia's energy is generated by hydroelectric plants that are susceptible to climate change.
Esas medidas son paliativos.
These are palliative measures. The solution should be structural by diversifying our energy sources and giving a push to alternative, renewable, and clean energy sources, and by looking at expanding our thermoelectric energy sources that can help back the hydroelectric plants.
The government insists the El Niño drought and other factors were to blame for the current energy crisis. But the question remains, will there be a long-term solution for the next power blackout? Michelle Begue, CCTV, Colombia.
I'm joined now by John Rome from New York. He's the Senior Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. And I want you to I want you to talk, if you will, about the change in direction at the World Bank. You've got a new climate action plan, which I guess really puts more of an emphasis on rebalancing your work to help countries adapting to climate change.
One of the major elements of our new climate action plan is to recognize that poverty alleviation and climate go hand in hand. If we don't take action soon to mitigate the impact of climate change on people, we'll probably see 100 million more people living in poverty by the year 2030. And in addition, if we can't flatten emissions to keep global warming below 2 degrees, no amount of resilience and adaptation will help poor people. So focusing on bringing development and climate change together is a key part of our overall strategy in terms of alleviating poverty.
So what can the World Bank do to help these developing countries actually hit their targets? It's going to take a considerable amount of investment, I would think.
Yeah, well, we're focusing on a number of key areas. One important one is on renewable energy, both through direct investments that we will make, but more importantly, helping countries put in place the right policy frameworks to attract private sector. The amount of private sector investment that will be needed in renewable energy will be huge. We've got technology on our side, we're seeing prices fall, but we also know that good policies, good bidding procedures that are transparent and reliable will result in falling prices. And so we will be looking to increase our financing for renewable energy and looking towards mobilizing private sector financing.
I read some of your work earlier this month, and I was kind of surprised at all the different facets of all of this, and I'm hoping maybe you can kind of elucidate one of them. I know that you're going to be working with cities dealing with an influx of people into urban areas. Flesh that one out for us.
So if you think by 2050, the world's likely to see 2 billion more people moving into cities. And so the challenge is, how do you provide services for those people, transport, housing, jobs, but at the same time reduce carbon emissions by focusing, for example, on compact cities, on more urban transport, but also improve resilience, particularly against floods. A number of Asian cities are very susceptible to flooding. And so thinking about where people live, how one builds drainage systems, how one ensures that canals are kept clean, all of these are important to put together cities that are both economically strong and deliver services and have low carbon emissions and are resilient to climate. A key part of this comes in the area of urban planning. A lot of these investments will have to take place over the next 15, 20, 30 years. So getting planning systems in place that these are taken into consideration from the beginning will be absolutely critical.
Flooding, let's talk about the flip side of that, because we've seen that as well. Drought, food, famine, also an issue. What do you do about that?
So you're right. In a number of places, we will see dramatic impacts from climate change on agriculture. 25% falls in productivity. Some of the things that we're working on, for example, in West Africa, we're working on developing new seeds that can be grown in a much shorter growing cycle so it can adapt. Second area we'll be focusing on, particularly of interest in Asia, would be on rice, to have rice that can deal with different lengths of growing period and different amounts of water, and focusing on irrigation. As rainfall patterns change, more extreme flooding, longer periods of no rain, putting in place irrigation systems that will store water and be able to adapt to these changing climates will be absolutely critical to ensure that production keeps going. And in many cases, this is an international issue. As you probably know, the Mekong Delta produces 25% of the rice that is sold on the world market. So ensuring that this can keep going, even if they're faced with increased typhoons, changing weather patterns, this is very important, not only for a country like Vietnam, for the global rice markets as well.
Yeah, John, I know you mentioned climate change threatens to drive about 100 million people more into poverty in the next 15 years. So give me your sense of what this day means to you, seeing all of these leaders of these countries stepping up, signing this agreement, basically saying, we're going to try and do something about this.
Right. So I think we're very optimistic. If you think back to Paris was where the negotiators did their job. They came together and they reached this truly historic agreement which gives us hope. Here in New York today, the leaders stood up and they signed. They said, we're on board, we're moving forward. That's great, that's excellent. We have a platform now to move. But it's not done yet. I think everybody can take the weekend to celebrate, take a short rest. But Monday morning, we need to get back to work to focus on implementation, implementation, implementation. It's going to take a lot of hard work by a large number of people in a large number of areas. And so focusing on getting that renewable energy out there, putting early warning systems in place, developing climate smart agriculture, putting better water management systems in place, putting a deeper price on carbon, all of these things are very important and will require a large number of people to come together focusing on implementation. But we shouldn't forget and take a little bit of time to celebrate what did happen here in New York today, built on the success of Paris.
All right, John, thanks so much for joining us from New York. Really appreciate it. The conservation effort extends far beyond the agreement signed at the UN. On this week's Full Frame, my colleague Mei Lee talks with some people who are finding innovative ways to save the planet, people like oceanographer Sylvia Earle.
You've said many times, no oceans, no us.
That's right.
I mean, that's how connected
life.
we are.
It's the living ocean. It's not just rocks and water, sand and all the beautiful natural physical structures. It's the living ocean and the living land. It's photosynthesis. It's the ability of green things on the land and in the sea, mostly in the sea, that generate oxygen, take up carbon, things that other creatures on Earth are oblivious to. This humans have the gift of knowing and of understanding what happens in a leaf, what happens in the water that makes Earth a place that's suitable for us. I mean, we look at Mars and say, oh, beautiful red planet, let's go live there. But then you think about, what are we going to eat? What are we going to breathe?
Right.
How are we going to withstand the temperature ups and downs? We need a living planet. So protecting areas that are in great shape. National Geographic calls these places pristine seas. And there are places that still remain. About half the coral reefs in the world are still in pretty good shape.
Okay.
The bad news is about half of them have been destroyed. When I came to the Caribbean as part of the Tektite mission in 1970, the reefs here were full of life. Today, those reefs are gone. We need to look at places around the coastal waters and in the high seas, everywhere, to say, we can restore the damage. We can't go back to what was, but we can make things better than they currently are. And there's plenty of evidence that works.